Good day, everyone. This is JP Schmitz with Global Scuba. We have a little video tech note that we're going to take some time and discuss some of the standard types of fittings that we offer. These fittings are for high pressure. They're used in a dive shop, kind of in the back in the work area. Not anything that actually pertains to gear, but it pertains to connecting compressors, whips, filtration systems, getting air into the tanks, things like that. So there are three basic types of fittings that we tend to see out there. This one right here is the most common type. This is a NPT fitting, 1/4 inch size. Almost everything that you see out there that we typically use is a 1/4 inch in size. With this type of fitting, it actually has a tapered thread. So when you screw this fitting together, the threads actually interfere and the tapers interfere, and that's what makes the seal. A pipe thread, or NPT, is one of the easiest threads to make a seal with. Now, this thread will typically need 2 to 3 wraps of Teflon tape on it. And this is a brass fitting, but they come in brass, steel, and stainless. You want to use the 2 or 3 wraps of Teflon on there for two reasons. One is there may be slight imperfections between the two threads, and the tape will take up some of those gaps and give you a good seal. The other reason, and this is actually probably the most important reason, is particularly with stainless steel or steel, you want to put Teflon tape on there and it functions as an anti-seize. And what I mean by anti-seize is if you ever need to take it apart, then it will be much, much easier if Teflon tape is on there. So this is the Teflon tape that we typically put on there. Pretty standard stuff. We offer it in oxygen compatible types, so you don't have to worry about that either. But standard fitting NPT, that's probably the most common one that most people know about. You can find this at Home Depot and other places like that. And you have to be very careful because the pressure ratings for the products at Home Depot may be much, much lower than what we need to use for the service that we have for this type of thing. So that's the NPT. Now we're going to move on to JIC. And this is a JIC fitting. We're looking at a male here. This is a dry fitting, meaning that we don't use any sealant on it. The way it makes it seal is there's a 37-degree, they call it a cone, but it's an angle on the end of that fitting. This is a male fitting. Here's a female fitting. The female fitting has the opposite of that 37-degree cone. It's got a funnel shape. When we put these fittings together, the cone and the funnel meet, and their interface makes the seal. Now, one of the advantages of JIC is it'll swivel until it's tight. So when you're putting things together, if you got 2 hose ends that need to be fixed, it makes it much, much easier to put them together because you can swivel it. And then when you're done and you want to make the seal, you just use a couple of wrenches and tighten it. Oops, this way, tighten it. And once it's tight, then it no longer swivels. JIC fittings got their origins in the world of hydraulics. And in the world of hydraulics, you're dealing with the fluid, which is liquid, or in oil, hydraulic oil. Very different than gas, the air that we're dealing with. Consequently, a JIC fitting, when we're using an air application for it, can be a little bit more difficult to seal. Sometimes you have to crank hard on this to make that seal work. Also, it's important to note that if you're mixing and matching fittings from different manufacturers, they may have slight manufacturing tolerances that make it harder to seal. So while a JIC fitting makes it easy to put together, just bear in mind, sometimes you really got to crank down on it to get it to stop leaking. So that's the JIC fitting. Now, the last fitting we typically use or see is what's called a tube fitting. And a tube fitting is in combination with stainless steel tubing. And this is typically used for permanent connections. So it's stuff that when we want to plumb, say, from our compressor to our filter towers, we use tubing like this because it's a permanent connection and it's robust, and it'll essentially last forever, particularly if we choose stainless. So one thing that we see when we look at a tube fitting, if we take it apart and we look inside there, these days there's two pieces. One is a compression ferrule, and the other is a washer. So what happens when this fitting goes together, the compression ferrule follows the washer first, and then this is inserted into the fitting. And then when we screw the nut on, it pushes that compression fitting together. And what it does is the compression fitting will squeeze down, and it'll squeeze the tube, and it'll also push out and squeeze against the outside diameter of the fitting. And that's how it actually makes it seal. Very efficient way to seal. One thing to note, when you're putting this together, the tube will actually deform. So when we tighten this together and screw it together, the tube deforms and the ferrule becomes a permanent piece of the tube. So it's kind of like one of those deals where if you tighten it once and you need to make a change, you're going to have to cut and put a new ferrule on. This part of the fitting can be reused anytime. So another quick note when we look at working with tube fittings is most of you, if you work with this stuff, you have to buy the tubing. It either comes in a roll or straight lengths. And we sell it. And more often than not, when you need to cut it, you'll use a tube cutter. And tube cutters work great. This is a 1/4-inch tubing, 3/16 stainless. Tube cutters work great on it. The problem that you run into with tube cutters is that they roll the end. So you can see this particular end right here. You can see the size of the hole there. That's actually from a tube cutter, and it's rolled the outside of the tube over. So it kind of squeezes that down. So some tubers come with deburring tools, others don't. We actually use a countersink to do it, but you can see once you take that the rollover portion away, the tube actually is much, much more open. And this is important because if we don't clear that up, you won't get the proper flow through this. So you kind of be buying an expensive 1/4-inch tube that doesn't give you the flow of the tube of that particular size. So that kind of gives you a basic background of the different fittings that we offer. And these are offered in various types, and they mix and they match. So for example, here's a tube fitting. It has a 1/4-inch NPT male on it. So with this GIC fitting, there's 2 1/4-inch NPT females on it. So we can mix and match and do many different things with these connecting things together. So lastly, I'd like to talk about materials. And we have 3 types of materials that we typically see in fittings. We have brass, steel, and stainless. So brass fittings, like this guy here, they're very easy to work with. Their pressurization class is roughly around 3,000 PSI, some a little bit higher, some a little bit lower, but basically we don't offer anything that's below 3,000 PSI in a brass fitting. Brass works very, very good. It's easy to work with. One of the things you have to watch out for, especially when you're mating dissimilar materials. So here we have a brass pipe fitting and a steel, this particular one is steel, fitting with a 1/4 NPT female. So when we put these two together, as you tighten this down, the steel fitting is stronger than the brass. And what that means is as you tighten this down, the brass will deform. So it'll actually, as it gets tighter, it'll shrink it down a little bit. So if it's something where you're taking it apart a lot and having to put it back together, eventually this brass fitting will go in further and further and further because it gets squeezed down, and eventually it'll never seal. So typically with brass, what you want to do is you want to kind of make those so that that's a one-time or a very limited number of times you're going to assemble and disassemble it. So that's brass. Here we actually have a combination. This is a steel fitting and this is a stainless fitting. They look similar in appearance. The steel fittings that we offer actually have a little bit rougher finish on them, a little bit different. Why do people go with steel fittings? People go with steel fittings for 2 reasons. Both stainless and steel fittings are a 5,000 PSI working pressure class. And they typically go with steel fittings because they're much, much less expensive. Steel is inexpensive. These steel fittings, like many steel fittings, have a plating on them, which is a fair plating, not a great plating. So as years pass, these eventually will rust. So if you go with steel fittings, your upfront cost is going to be less expensive, but down the road you're going to have to replace it because eventually it'll rust and you'll end up potentially getting contaminants in your airstream from it. This fitting here is stainless, and all the fittings that we offer in stainless are 3/16. So 3/16 offers pretty much the ultimate in corrosion resistance that is readily available in fittings.